Calgary. And if that's my good fortune, it's my real delight to welcome you all to this, the 2021 edition of the Merv Leitch QC Memorial Lecture. I want to begin in the spirit of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission by acknowledging that we are gathered today on lands that were in the traditional ownership of the First Nations of Treaty 6 and Treaty 7, and lands that are also the traditional home of the Métis Nation of Alberta. The Leitch Lecture is one of the highlights of our academic year every year, and I often say that to me it represents an Alberta success story because it's an illustration of partnership between the two law schools in this province. So I'm speaking to you today on behalf of both the law school at the University of Calgary and our friends and colleagues at the University of Alberta. And in that regard, I want to offer my congratulations to all of the students who today are being celebrated for having received Merv Leitch scholarships. I want to thank the Leitch family for allowing us to celebrate Mr. Leitch in this way. Merv Leitch was one of the greatest generation of Canadians. He was an Albertan, not born into wealth, far from it. When war broke out in 1939, he joined the Royal Canadian Navy like so many other prairie boys. He returned to Calgary at the end of the war, became a lawyer, and proceeded to be part of that group of people who, having defended democracy, and proceeded to build our province and our city and our cities as we know them today. Merv Leitch was part of that extraordinary group of people who was recruited by Peter Lougheed to usher in a modern era of government in Alberta. And it's thanks to Mr. Lougheed's initiative that when Mr. Leitch passed away far, far too early, that money was raised to allow our two law schools to carry on in perpetuity this memorial lecture series in his honor. Now, I said a moment ago that this was, in my view, an Alberta success story because it's a partnership between our law school and the law school at the University of Alberta. And in that regard, now I'd like to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Dean Barbara Billingsley from the University of Alberta. Barb.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dean Holloway, for introducing the event and passing off the microphone to me for a moment. I, of course, want to begin by welcoming everyone to this prestigious lecture on behalf of the University of Alberta Faculty of Law. This is my first turn as Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta to help host this lecture, and I'm very, very excited to do so. It has been a long and proud tradition at our faculty. A special welcome and thank you to Vassy Kapelos for agreeing to deliver this year's Leitch Lecture after COVID disrupted the plan for her to deliver the lecture last year. Even a year into COVID, it's very different speaking to an audience over Zoom instead of in person, and I very much appreciate your willingness to adapt to this occasion. I also want to thank Dean Holloway and the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta for partnering with us on today's event as every year. And I'm pleased and grateful that we're joined today by so many recipients of the 2019 and 2020 Leitch Scholarships at the University of Alberta and the University of Calgary. Congratulations to all of the students who received these awards. And of course, personally and on behalf of the University of Alberta Faculty of Law, I want to acknowledge and thank the Leitch family for their generous support of this lecture series and of the scholarship program. It's now my honor and pleasure to introduce Jim Leitch. Jim is, of course, the son of Merv Leitch QC, for whom this lecture series is named. Currently, Jim is a lawyer with Alberta Justice and the Solicitor General's office in Edmonton, presently serving as one of the Legislative Counsel in the Legislative Counsel office. He previously worked with the legal team advising Service Alberta and spent 7 years as Legislative Counsel with Alberta Justice and Solicitor General. Prior to that, Jim spent 8 years as Director of the Legislative Planning and Freedom of Information and Privacy Branch with Alberta Transportation and Alberta Infrastructure, and 5 years with Alberta Municipal Affairs, all of those positions being in Edmonton. Before his time in the public service and before he and his wife Shannon moved back to Edmonton, Jim ran a general practice of law in Calgary, from 1991 to 1996 and continued practicing until March of 1998 when he joined Alberta Municipal Affairs. On the personal side, Jim, like me, was born in Calgary, as were his two sisters and late brother. He moved to Edmonton with his family in 1972 as a young boy after his father was elected as part of the Lougheed government in the 1971 Alberta election. Jim completed virtually all of his primary and secondary schooling in Edmonton and obtained his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Alberta in 1986. He then moved back to Calgary and obtained his LLB from the University of Calgary's Faculty of Law in 1989 and articled with McLeod and Company in Calgary, being called to the Alberta Bar in September 1990. Today, Jim lives with his wife Shannon in Edmonton and continues to support the Calgary-based professional sports teams. Up until his grandniece Ivy took up playing rugby for Canada West Championship Calgary Dinos, he divided his allegiance in cheering for the university teams between the two alma maters, Calgary and Alberta. But now I'm told it's Dinos all the way due to his grandnieces playing for the rugby team. With that, I will hand it over to Jim Leitch.
Thanks very much, Dean Billingsley. I'm not sure if I'm live here or not.
You are good. You are good.
Okay. Thank you, Dean Billingsley, for that kind introduction, and to Dean Holloway and the faculties and staff of both law schools for this ongoing partnership for the lecture series and the scholarships. To the members of the bench and of the bar, especially members of the former McLeod-Dixon firm, now part of Norton Rose Fulbright, our extended family, friends, especially longtime family friends, colleagues, classmates, and coworkers past and present in Canada or otherwise, fellow DUs, the faculties and staff, of course, the students of both faculties, and especially the scholarship winners, and our guest lecturer, Vassy Kapelos, who I'll have the pleasurable duty of introducing in a few minutes. Greetings on behalf of my sisters, Jan and Kathy, and our stepmother, Ardeen, and their families, and our sister-in-law, Glenda, and brother-in-law, Scott, and their family. As Dean Holloway said, it's always a highlight of the year for us, albeit not in person this year as we all would like. But this past year, of course, has been very difficult for everyone in the saddest and most severe cases through personal loss, whether from COVID or otherwise, and that's touched our extended families. So, on the theme of family, let me just note two in particular as a sort of a special hello. A little ways west of Edinburgh, Scotland, it's the dinner hour, and some of our Scottish cousins on our mom's side, the Buchanan family, might just be looking in, so hello to them. And closer to home and of integral importance to not simply the lecture series and the scholarships, but our lives, is the Lougheed family. It's some 75 years ago next fall at the late Premier Lougheed, and our parents came separately to the U of A and met. We're not certain that the future Mrs. Lougheed started that year or the year after, but the four of them and many others from that time became very fast friends. I think we might have at least one of the Lougheed children on the line at the moment. My friend and fellow baby of the family, Joe Lougheed, a lawyer with Dentons in Calgary. So I want to say hello to him and the other kids on our behalf. And on the Lougheed family, I just wanted to take a moment to express our condolences to the family on the passing of their mother, Jean Lougheed, at the end of last year. That's a loss felt profoundly by, of course, her family and children and grandchildren, but also by our province and nation, because of the ongoing advocacy and work that she did for the arts and for the disabled. And there are probably a couple of her contemporaries on the line as well, longtime family and friends of ours who know who they are, who feel that loss too. On a happier note, congrats to the scholarship winners. I can tell you from looking at the 14 biographies of them that I felt simultaneously deeply impressed and deeply inadequate for someone who's probably twice the age of all of them and has only accomplished about half as much. They're all remarkable people, so we look forward to good things from them. Dean Holloway alluded to this a bit, but I usually do a little commercial to clarify, because we often in the family get thanks from the scholarship winners in particular. And I just wanted to point out and reinforce that, of course, the lecture series and the scholarships, although they bear our dad's name, come from the efforts of Mr. Lougheed, who, from our understanding from the Lougheed family, only undertook two major fundraising projects of a non-political nature in his life. One was for the restoration of Lougheed House in Calgary, which I commend to all of you for a visit. And the other was this lecture series and the scholarships that are related to it. So he also was a person who was powerful enough to convince my dad to admit that he might be worthy of such an honor. So we owe gratitude to him and them as well. I think those are all my introductory thank you remarks, but I now have one last pleasurable duty of the day, and that's introducing our guest speaker, Vassy Kapelos, who was to be, as some of you will remember, the lecture about a year ago as well, and then something called COVID got in the way. Vassy has a few things I think to say during her own remarks about her upbringing, so I won't steal those from her. I'll just note that anybody who follows political discourse and coverage in Canada at all knows who she is. She is currently, as of 3 years and 2 days ago, the host of CBC's flagship political program, Power and Politics. And before that was also the anchor of Global's political affairs show, The West Block. She obtained a BA in 2004 from Western Ontario and an MA from Dalhousie in 2006, both in political science, focusing on the debt crisis in Argentina. She has reported from stories I think all over the world, but will be known to people in Alberta for her time as provincial affairs reporter with Global here for a number of years. And she received, among other things, in terms of recognition, the Edward R. Murrow Award for her work on a series called Code Red, which exposed the shortcomings of Edmonton's emergency response system. Mr. Murrow is someone who was probably most notable now or most recognized from a movie from back in 2005 called Good Night and Good Luck, which focused on his journalistic work on the McCarthy era. So that is something that should tell you, if you don't already know, about how special a person she is. We're looking very forward to her remarks. So Vassy, I invite you to take it away.
Thank you so much. Everyone hear me okay? Just want to make sure before I start.
You're good. You're good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for such a warm welcome. Dean Holloway and Dean Billingsley, thanks for your introduction and your introductory remarks. And Mr. Leitch, thank you for your kind introduction as well. Though my time in Edmonton covering the legislature came a few years later than your dad's time in office, his legacy loomed large, and it's truly an honor to be delivering this speech for a program in his name. Congratulations as well to all the award winners. As I mentioned last night, you will make your parents proud in ways I can only dream of. As most of you know, this speech, and as previously mentioned, was supposed to happen a year ago, and it was supposed to happen in person. I remember sitting in a group with producers of our show, yes, in person, and discussing for what seemed like forever whether we should go to Alberta or cancel the trip. There were no rules in place yet, no consensus on whether there was a pandemic about to take hold, no concept of how it might affect us at an individual level. Just a sense of apprehension, a queasy feeling that things might change and it might not be a good idea to travel for a few weeks until this whole thing just kind of blew over. I can look back now and can't believe, or I look back now and can't believe how hard I fought the idea we couldn't go to Alberta, how long we told ourselves things wouldn't be like this for too long, and that almost instinctual feeling I had that Canada couldn't be hit that hard. Just like when I try to predict the outcome of elections, I was wrong, totally wrong. So when I was thinking of what to talk about for this iteration of the lecture, it was obvious the pandemic, which has, I think, overtaken all of our lives, would have to factor in. Last year, I was going to tackle the relationship between Ottawa and Alberta, but like everything in the last year, even that has become far more complicated, far more intertwined, and about far more than just politics. I come by my interest in politics naturally, I would argue at least. My parents met at a political convention in Ontario, and most of what I remember from my formative years involved my parents yelling at each other about something to do with Brian Mulroney. I have no idea what. I just remember the former prime minister's name was bandied about often at the dinner table. In the same vein, my interest in the relationship between provinces and the relationship between them and the federal government was born through experience as well. In the interest of full disclosure and at great risk to myself, particularly with this audience, I can now admit I was born and raised in downtown Toronto. For close to a decade, maybe a bit more, I didn't admit that. When a cab driver in London, Ontario would ask where I was coming from, I would say, just another part of Ontario. When my station managers in Swift Current, Saskatoon, and Edmonton would ask where I grew up, I'd say out east, and they'd nod, not really wanting to know the details so they could keep liking me, I'm pretty sure. Hating people from downtown Toronto might be the only thing that brings people from all over this country together, but it also gave me a taste for the distaste so many Canadians feel for what they perceive to be a centralized location of power and those who wield it. My schooling took me from Toronto to London, as I mentioned, and then Halifax. And then my career took me from Swift Current to Saskatoon to Edmonton and then back to Ottawa. Moving from Toronto to Swift Current was just the tiniest of culture shocks, though I'd never let that on when I was there. I admit the following only again in the interest of full disclosure, but when I applied to the online TV station in Speedy Creek, as it's known, I had to Google Swift Current on a map. If I had spent 10 minutes in my entire life thinking about Saskatchewan, I would probably have been stretching the truth. My dad actually admitted as much when my parents came to visit me for the first time. We were in the one and only men's clothing store in Swift when we ran into then Premier Brad Wall. In true Saskatchewan and not Toronto fashion, Mr. Wall said hello to me and my dad and proceeded to ask my dad what he thought of Saskatchewan upon his first visit. Ever the tactful Greek, my dad looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Other than the riders, I don't think I ever have." My father had no idea he had said anything wrong, and Mr. Wall, thank goodness, laughed. But my story illustrates how much growing up where I did insulated me to the various parts of this country and how different they can be. The best part of my job and my career has been shedding that insulation. Spending years out east and in Alberta and Saskatchewan made me a more empathetic person. What does empathy have to do with politics? In my case, a lot. Instead of looking at things from a perspective only informed by my upbringing, I draw on my experiences in other regions, and even they themselves are not monolithic. Alberta's north, for example, has oil problems. It also has pine beetle problems. And Gravelbourg is not Saskatoon. I'm oversimplifying it, but I think you get what I mean. No region is the same as another, and no region is uniform in and of itself. And so it's with that lens that I'll take you through a brief history of federal-provincial relations and into the pandemic, which from my perspective has completely changed the game, at least for now. The balancing act between provincial and federal powers stretches back to the Constitution and has been through many an interpretation and battle since. Taxation, world wars, the Supreme Court, universal healthcare, the Canada Pension Plan, the NEP, Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords, and the Quebec referendum kind of sum it up. My focus will be the last 5 years or so. When Justin Trudeau campaigned in the 2015 election, he did so with a specific promise to, as he characterized, better the relationship with provinces and their premiers. His predecessor, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, met one-on-one with premiers, but only twice with all of them. It was during one of those meetings under Trudeau that you could see things might not go as promised. And bear with me, I'm about to attempt to put a video on. It'll just take me a second.
On this bitterly cold Ottawa day, all the Prime Minister wanted to talk to premiers about was climate.
This is a global issue.
Justin Trudeau's goal, get provinces to sign on to a framework for achieving national carbon reduction targets. To convince them, he brought an unexpected salesman, outgoing Vice President Joe Biden.
The rest of the world's looking at you. I feel a great deal of confidence because you're all here. Thank you.
But the star-powered pitch didn't work on everyone.
I just don't think we're ready to sign something like this. We haven't done the homework on it. So therefore, I'm not going to sign on to a deal for which I can't be accountable to the people that sent me here in the first place.
Saskatchewan's premier is worried a national price on carbon will hit his province's economy hard. Any change? 2 seconds. Any change in
Everything's
this
the
plan?
same. Everything, all the things I said this morning are the same.
At first, Christy Clark was concerned BC would end up paying more as a resource-rich province. But after threatening not to sign on, Trudeau capitulated to her demands and agreed to an independent assessment of the impact of a national carbon price on every province.
We should say thank you to the Canadian government and Prime Minister for allowing this level of flexibility.
So the feds are forging ahead with a deal without Saskatchewan and Manitoba.
The Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. An ambitious and achievable framework to address climate change and grow the clean economy for our children and grandchildren.
Another thorn in the federal government's side. As much as Trudeau wants to talk about climate, premiers, even his closest ally, would rather talk about healthcare.
The preoccupation of all of the premiers this morning is with healthcare. And, the understanding that we haven't had that same robust discussion on healthcare.
Ottawa's portion of provincial healthcare costs is set to shrink next year. Provinces are poised to take a $1 billion hit. The issue didn't make the official agenda. It will only be discussed tonight during dinner.
It puts tremendous pressure on us between bites to come to a complex solution to a very complex public policy issue.
Battles like these between the feds and provinces aren't new. There's a reason, after all. The last prime minister stopped meeting with all the premiers. But tensions in the relationship aren't making Trudeau's life easy. And with sticking points as big as climate and healthcare, that likely won't change anytime soon.
So that was a story I did back in December of 2016 when premiers had assembled in Ottawa to talk climate change, and specifically, as you heard there, the Pan-Canadian framework the federal government had put forward. I remember it really clearly because it was an oddly kind of quiet day. Meetings went on, but promised media availabilities kept getting delayed until BC's then Premier Christy Clark came out to say BC would not get on board with the plan. We frantically raced to get that news out. The deal might not make it. But within a few hours, another makeshift press conference, this one from the then federal climate minister, Catherine McKenna, or environment minister, Catherine McKenna. The deal was done, albeit with some holdouts, Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Ultimately, though, the Fed said, like it or not, the framework would apply starting a couple years later. And with that, it became clear Trudeau's promise to work with the premiers was not one to cede to them, a distinction that became more significant as the premiers cycled through and more of them fell into the opposite side of the political spectrum from Trudeau. All of a sudden, or maybe not so suddenly, provincial politicians and the prime minister weren't just battling it out in office, but also during elections. Much of the 2018 election in Ontario and the 2019 election in Alberta wasn't even about provincial opposition parties, it was about Ottawa. And the same can be said about the federal election, which now feels like it was 200 years ago. It was actually just in October of 2019. There's no doubt Doug Ford's name was invoked by the Liberals more than Andrew Scheer's, and it worked for them in Ontario, where the Liberals captured 79 of 121 seats. Travel a few provinces over and the outcome was much different. No seats for the governing party in either Saskatchewan or Alberta. The storyline to emerge from that election was one of national unity or lack thereof. There is a lot of good debate about how bad of a unity crisis it is, or it was, or whether there's been worse. But one thing became clear after that election. The relationship between the feds and provinces was going to be a focus politically of this next mandate, for better or for worse. And that takes us into the pandemic. Because what we shortly found out, less than 5 months later, was that things got a lot worse. The pandemic hit, and I would argue the relationship between the federal government and provinces might never be the same. If you can remember back to that first day when this country realized things were going to change, it was a Thursday in March, about exactly a year ago nearly. The morning was full of rumors, I can tell you from my perspective, of a scheduled meeting between premiers and the prime minister in Ottawa, that it might be moved or canceled or something. I remember calling my contacts in their offices frantically, and nobody had any idea what was going to happen. We pre-taped, so we did a live to tape interview with New Brunswick's Premier Blaine Higgs, in which he said he's not coming. And that's when I knew things were not going to be the same. They were going to go off the rails. Some premiers had started arriving in Ottawa for the meeting, thinking it might still happen or a version of it. And then I got a call from someone in the Prime Minister's office. Get ready to go on TV. Sophie has the virus, I was told. Just going to share another video.
What I can tell you though is what they do say, that speaking engagement that you're referring to, the Prime Minister's wife apparently began. It doesn't have an exact timeline of A, when she was there, or B, when she returned, which I think would be significant for sure, where those questions that you raise are concerned, but that she began exhibiting mild flu-like symptoms, including a low fever late last night. So all we know as far as the timeline is concerned is that she came back recently, having recently returned is what they say, and that her symptoms appeared late last night. And then they also say that her symptoms have since subsided.
We've got an actual board of that post. So why don't we show our viewers right now? And I know our teams will be looking for the, in and out dates, if you will, of that trip to London. But there you can see the Prime Minister's wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, and also Margaret Trudeau. They're in London. So that's the question that we will be asking as well, is when was the in time? When was the out time? Were there symptoms involved while she was visiting in London? And that call to Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, will be making today, I suppose. There will be discussions going above and beyond and getting personal as to these visits. But Vassy, your team at Power and Politics, you have so many viewers who get those ministers on, who listen to those interviews. What is the angle you're tackling right now that we can prep our viewers for? And I'm wondering if it's whether the Prime Minister can continue in this capacity, working from home, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, this certainly changes the discussion going forward. This is, very significant that the Prime Minister would have to self-isolate. He's not exhibiting any symptoms. I think, from our perspective, you got to think about, for example, how many interactions he's had over the past few days, the number of cabinet committee meetings as well as cabinet meetings, and whether or not that will impact any other ministers. We're planning to speak with Minister Heidi this evening on the show, and surely we'll be able to ask her that. I think, it's important to bring forward some of the details that his office did release and make sure that we stick to what we know at this point, and that is that I'm just going to read exactly what the doctor's advice, according to his office, was to continue daily activities while self-monitoring, given he's exhibiting no symptoms himself. And then it says, however, out of an abundance of caution, the Prime Minister is opting to self-isolate and work from home until receiving Sophie's results. So I think a lot of sort of next steps and further follow-up questions will depend on what those results of that test, of that COVID-19 test for Sophie Gregoire Trudeau actually are. So what comes of that? And then, from that, we'll be able to determine how deep the impact of it potentially is throughout Parliament, throughout cabinet, throughout the effect it has on the other politicians that have interacted rather with the Prime Minister. But what I can tell you though.
So I play that because, first of all, I can't believe how not pregnant I look. But second of all, I'll never forget that moment. It was unlike other breaking news I've covered. There really is nothing like the rush of learning things seconds before you go to air, conveying what you know and what you don't, almost following a bouncing ball with no idea where it will land and no margin for error. I think it's kind of the best part of my job. But this was different. Within 20 minutes after the news about Sophie Gregoire Trudeau came a release about the Premier's meeting going virtual. What a novel concept that was then. And the best way I can describe it at the time is kind of out of body. You're delivering the news, but realizing at the same time, life is completely changing. And if I'm being honest, it was a bit scary. It almost felt like I was part of a movie, not real life. That virtual meeting between the premiers and the Prime Minister, we couldn't have known then, but was about to become the weekly norm. More than 24 of them have since taken place. I want to put that into context for a second. Former Prime Ministers Mulroney and Trudeau were known to hold a bunch of these, but together over a few decades, they still only combine for about the same number that's taken place over the last year. It's not just that, it was what was happening on those calls, a Team Canada approach, as premiers and federal politicians alike called it. An amazing level of cooperation, both privately and publicly facing. It was a love-in with great purpose. The country was facing a pandemic. I mean, they're politicians, they read the room. Canadians were scared for their health and their financial security. The last thing they needed was to hear politicians fighting each other. Behind the scenes, it was equally remarkable. Premier's staff, who would regularly speak to me on background about what dastardly things the feds had done, had nothing bad to say. One particular foe of the Prime Minister's even said to me, "If we don't row in the same direction, we'll all sink. I have no choice." And it went both ways. People around the Prime Minister were singing Jason Kenney's praises, for example, on background calls for his constructive nature in those early talks. I can tell you this was not what I was used to hearing from them. But something more consequential was happening beyond the niceties, which I think has the potential to last well beyond the pandemic. The federal government's fiscal capacity to respond has increased its role or impact in the Federation. At least 8 out of every $10 spent on healthcare and financial supports have come from the feds. Think about that for a second. 80 to 90% of everything done in response to this pandemic, multiple areas of provincial jurisdiction, has come from Ottawa. That alone has changed the nature of federalism this year, though it's not certain that's a permanent thing. Think for a second about all the areas of provincial jurisdiction the Fed spent money on. Public health, long-term care, they sent the army in after all, rent, municipal budgets, sick leave, wage top-ups for essential workers. The list feels almost endless. And then as the pandemic became less of a shock to our lives and more of a way of life, the fractures between provinces and the feds, well, they formed again, highlighted by the divide over vaccines. Things got downright vicious as Canadians wondered why we were vaccinating less of our population, well, we are, than other countries, and provinces lamented the Fed's supply issues, while the feds insisted everything would work out. The niceties in front and behind the cameras waned. The election of Joe Biden highlighted pre-pandemic battles over resources, and COVID ended up breathing new life into the what's old is new again, back and forth over federal health transfers. And that brings us to the present. In order to figure out whether the pandemic has fundamentally altered the relationship between provinces and the federal government, I contend there are 3 key areas to watch. The first is pandemic spending. As I mentioned earlier, the federal government spends so much in areas the provinces are normally responsible for. How the feds extricate themselves from that funding will be key. The finance minister's mandate letter made it clear that spending was supposed to be temporary, but taking it away is not going to be easy. No more sick leave benefit, no more top-ups for essential workers, no more help with municipal budgets. Do provinces have the fiscal capacity or political will to take over that spending, or for the residents to live without it? I'm going to guess the answer differs depending on the province, and I don't think stepping out of all of those spaces is going to be as easy as some in the federal government might hope it will be. Next, climate change policy and resource development will also be something to watch, not necessarily because of the pandemic, but in part because of the Supreme Court's upcoming decision on the carbon tax. It's been a point of division between some provinces and the feds, and a win for the feds would cement their climate plan. A loss would complicate things moving forward and provide provinces with assurances about their own jurisdiction. Concerns about Line 3 and 5 are just starting to ramp up, and Keystone will likely continue to loom as an irritant between prairie provinces and Ottawa. Have a listen to what I mean.
And the government of Canada told us that they supported this until they folded yesterday. Things did not fold when the Trump administration threatened to tear up NAFTA and impose steel tariffs on this country. So, Vassy, we cannot allow this precedent to stand without a meaningful response, because that invites further aggression from the same political forces in the United States against the largest element of Canadian trade.
Certainly not disputing the effect that it's going to have on Albertans. I'm mindful of the people who lost their jobs. But in essence, you're saying you want the federal government to tout a climate plan, which you have opposed voraciously, and if not, to apply sanctions that would not be in equal retribution as the ones under NAFTA would be. They would have an effect on Canadian consumers, would they not?
Well, let me back up to your earlier comment about the tariffs. They weren't about NAFTA per se. They were specifically in response to U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum exports. That is about a $10 billion annual bilateral trade. Vassy, the energy trade is nearly $100 billion.
All indications are that President Biden is going to keep his campaign pledge, and he's going to rescind the permit. And we understand that. We respect that, in fact, and we will, of course, be there for the people of Alberta. So this is something that we'll wait to see what happens, and it is a promise that he did make to the American people.
So from your perspective, is this the final decision? Like there's no recourse for your government?
We're going to work with the United States, and we're very optimistic about our relationship with the new administration, whether it's trade, security, multilateralism, climate change. Also, energy security is a file that has existed between Canada and the United States. We are their biggest energy supplier. We are a very reliable one. So that one is never really off the table.
Respectfully, that didn't answer the question, though. Is this, from your perspective, a final decision? Is the project dead?
The president, if he in fact signs that executive order, is rescinding the permit. So that is something that may happen.
Sorry, were you able to see that?
No, we weren't able to
Oh,
see
no.
it, but we
Did
heard
you hear it?
We heard it. Yep.
Oh boy, my apologies. This is why I'm not a technical person. I'll play the next one properly. Taking a turn from that was Premier Kenney and Mark Garneau, the new Foreign Affairs Minister. In the first exchange, the Premier, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, is asking for Ottawa to take a more active role in fighting Keystone, and Ottawa, as you could hear, or the Minister was reticent to describe any activity or to formally conclude that the deal was dead. Beyond that irritant, I'm also watching another big irritant, and that is healthcare transfers. It sounds wild and exciting, I know, but this issue, though decades in the making, is one that unites every single premier, and in a renewed way, thanks to the pandemic. Last week, as I was putting the finishing touches on this speech, the premiers appeared all together at a virtual press conference, each telling a story of someone in their province who had to wait too long for surgery or missed out on a life-saving treatment because there isn't enough money in the system. The stories were compelling, and here's how the response went.
That's the problem on an individual level that we're facing. We're losing people because of our failure to get health care to people sooner. We need to change that. When I raised this story, a true story with the Prime Minister, he looked across the table at me and said, "I'm not your banker."
Just very quickly, Minister, when you said unconditional, that means when you do agree to some sort of formula for an increase, there will be no strings attached to that money.
Well, that's the context now, Vassy, of the Canada Health Transfer. But a lot of Canadians are saying to us that in the past, when the government transferred money to provinces, increased money, if it was Mr. Martin's government, if it was Mr. Chrétien's government, increased transfers to provinces for healthcare, some people are saying to us they're not seeing the results they expect. That's why, for example, some years ago, we transferred billions of additional dollars to provinces and territories, specifically focused on mental health and on home care. And we think that's also a successful way to support increased transfers. So we're prepared to have those conversations.
Are you and your counterparts prepared to commit to increasing money at the same degree you're expecting the federal government to?
We already have. The provinces have already increased their proportion. They're investing 78% of every healthcare dollar across the nation. So the provinces are already there. It's the federal government that needs to increase their support of providing healthcare.
But the Parliamentary Budget Watchdog has a different assessment, right? It says that actually when the feds were committing more, the provinces decreased the portion that they were putting forward. Are you committing to the idea that you as Premier would never decrease the portion that you're putting forward if the feds do pony up more?
as we move forward, we're all going to be investing more in healthcare as far as the dollar amounts go.
Okay, two specific questions where provinces are concerned for you, Minister. First of all, around the health transfer. I noticed one mention of it in the document, and it was to point out that as a result of the Safe Restart program, federal health supports for provinces are up 23% relative to last year's Canada Health Transfer. Are we to interpret that as there isn't a more permanent increase to the transfer coming?
You are a very careful reader, Vassy. Thank you for that. That reference was quite intentional. And, you know, when we added up the numbers, we saw something, you know, that I think has actually been evident to Canadians since the beginning of this crisis, that the federal government has been there to support the health effort, which of course is done on the front lines by provinces and territories.
As you can hear from those exchanges, there are still two big questions to answer in order to figure out if health transfers will alter the Federation fundamentally. First, the Prime Minister has signaled, as of December of last year, that he agrees the CHT has to increase, but the federal government, he or his cabinet members, won't say by how much or when they'll decide, just that it probably won't happen until after the pandemic. The second big question is whether new money that flows is actually free of conditions, as is normally the case with the CHT, or if strings are attached, which has been the case with extra pockets of healthcare money coming from Ottawa during the Prime Minister's mandate. Think mental health or home care money. As you heard from that snippet of the interview with Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc, the answer isn't clear. That sets us up for an age-old battle with a bit of a new twist. The provinces want $28 billion more for healthcare, but might have to agree to permanent federal infringement on their traditional turf, thanks to the healthcare issues the pandemic has laid bare, which may work, say, in a more politically aligned province like Nova Scotia. But can you picture that going over in Quebec or even Alberta for that matter? Overall, I view the pandemic's impact on the Federation much like its impact on our own lives. At some point, goodness, I hope sooner rather than later, things will return to normal. But there will be things that stick with us for a while. Anxiety in public places, in huge crowds, a different sort of relationship with the family we've been spent so much time with. It won't be like flipping a switch, and the same can be said of the Federation. The provinces and feds have gone through the biggest crisis in a generation. It's bound to shape their relationship over the next generation. What is yet to be determined is by how much. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Vassy, for that compelling and thought-provoking review of federalism in the age of COVID. I know it raises many questions, some of which you've touched on, and I'm sure that our audience members have questions they'd like to pose to you. So for that portion of today's presentation, I'm pleased to introduce two of the 2019 Leitch Scholarship recipients, Jared Armstrong and Nahani Falens, who are going to moderate the question and answer portion of this presentation.
Thank you, Dean Billingsley. Vassy has generously offered to answer a few of our questions, so please do type your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can in the time that we have. I'll start us off here, Vassy, with a question that comes from one of last year's award winners. Actually, it's a bit lengthy, but I think it's well stated. So stick with me here. Mainstream media seems to like cases but dislike law, including at the Supreme Court and including federalism cases. Why does the discussion of the legal significance of court decisions beyond the context of the particular case seem to be lost in media that reaches most Canadians? For example, the Vaviloff case changed the way Canadians relate to government agencies and affects everything from utilities, regulation to decisions about the CBC, but all that mainstream media seems concerned about was the citizenship status of the children of Russian spies. And the person asking the question says they fear that something similar will come to light with the ruling on the carbon pricing legislation. The question, I guess, goes back
something
to
similar in that, like, we would focus on the wrong things. Maybe is that the ask?
Exactly. Yeah, focusing on the actual cases themselves and not the law and the impact coming from those decisions.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I hesitate to speak on behalf of all mainstream media because I'm just one person at one outlet. I certainly understand the tendency to lump us all together, and I get that. But I do like to preface my comments by saying I can only speak for myself. I mean, when I was reporting for I used to report for Global for a number of years. I covered the Supreme Court intermittently, so that's probably one strike against me and our coverage. There's a lot of effort that goes in at this, and I'm talking specifically of the Supreme Court, where there's an officer who specifically, there's briefings that happen, takes media questions, because the reality is I don't come at it with any kind of legal background. Most of the time I'm looking at the clearest way to explain things to people who pay no attention to the issues that we're talking about. And probably at times, I can imagine if you're coming at it and listening to it as someone who is super informed, who does understand not only the case, but its kind of grander implications, that it could seem basic to you, or as you say, maybe we're focusing on the wrong thing. I don't know if there's something structural that could be done to address that. I just know I can explain the way we come at it is like, I'm always trying to think of, okay, if you're watching our show, how does this affect your life? How can I explain this in a way that doesn't seem like I'm talking at you? And that makes you care about the implications here. I mean, feel free to send me your thoughts on the decision. I do think the decision from, I mean, I'm always thinking in a political way, the decision from the carbon pricing will be the decision on carbon pricing rather will be a significant one politically, but I certainly don't want to get it wrong when I discuss its impact. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think it has something to do with, there's not many people who exclusively cover that anymore. And so you come at it, you try to understand it as best you can, but certainly you're not coming at it with a background that could be even remotely compared to the people watching this.
Thank you. I have another longer question for you. One of the major narratives built around the 2019 election was the fact that the Tories swept all but one seat in Alberta and Saskatchewan with 69 and 64% of the popular vote, respectively. Do you think that the electoral system that we currently utilize exacerbates the often fraught nature between Ottawa and the Prairie relationship by denying that the vote in Ottawa to 1 in 3 Prairie voters who don't vote Conservative at the federal level?
That's an excellent question, and one I think the genesis of it is one that I tried to address in my comments around regions not being monoliths. That's something that I think is also endemic to like where you grow up, right? So if you grow up in Toronto, you think all of Alberta is about the oil sands, and like that's what you hear predominantly through the media, but also through a lot of the politicians who are elected. And I certainly realized during my time in both Saskatchewan and Alberta that isn't the case, not necessarily as it pertains to oil or whatever the specific issue is, but that I think it's wrong to sort of paint the entire province or the two provinces with a single brush. That said, the results of that, and as I alluded to in my speech, were consequential. I mean, they did sweep both Alberta and Saskatchewan. I think there was a lot of discussion in the minutes in the weeks right after, in the hours right after, about whether or not a change in the electoral system would have led to a different outcome, and therefore that whole, as I mentioned, that whole back and forth about whether or not this was a national unity crisis and to what degree might have been muted or mitigated to a certain degree. The fact is, the federal government has not, promised, the Trudeau government promised to bring in electoral reform and then dropped the promise. It was one of the clearest kind of promises that they broke. And they said at the time that it was because they just did not see the support for that across the rest of the country. And I know there's obviously a lot of pushback to that idea, and that also depends somewhat regionally. We've seen different provincial examples where it's like they're going to go ahead with it, and then because of referendums or other things, they don't either. So I think there's a lot of merit to the idea, and there's a lot of people that want to talk about it, and I understand why, especially in reference to the outcome of the 2019 election. But for some reason, when the endeavors, though there are endeavors to do it in this country, they are not followed through on, especially by parties who still get into power.
Another question here, specifically to your role in the media here, and the question asks, how do you try to balance national reporting when for those outside of Ontario and Quebec, it can seem like we are often given a much smaller spotlight on issues and sometimes feels that airtime seems to be limited to when there's nothing to report in Ontario or Quebec?
Oh, that's a great question. I take it to heart. I hope I can convey genuinely. I think it's part of the reason I got hired in this job was because of my experience elsewhere, and in my interviews for it, my insistence that there needs to be more coverage that is not just sort of an afterthought. I completely sympathize and understand the feeling that it is dominated by issues in central Canada. And I think to a large degree, that's because of where all these newscasts originate from, right? I'm in Ottawa. When I previously worked for Global, I was in Ottawa. I mean, most of the newscasts are anchored out of Toronto or Ottawa, though in Global's case, it was Vancouver as well. So there's no, I don't think there's any justification or any reasoning. I don't think it's purposeful that it ends up being that way. I think it's a function of where people working on these shows, where people working in the media are situated, and we all have to do a better job of being cognizant of that and trying to ensure that we're aware of it, and then therefore we add more content to our programs. I have a 3-hour show now, so I have really no excuse for it. There's a lot of, tonight I was just telling the dean prior to this, tonight we have the energy minister in Calgary on. I have the premiers out west on, as frequently, if not more frequently than, actually we never have the premier of Ontario. He's never agreed to come on the show, nor the premier of Quebec. So I know that I can't speak for everybody. I just have a sense, having worked in a lot of newsrooms, about how the decisions are made, and it's certainly not. It's not because they don't want to be covering it. It's like I said, the ignorance that I possessed a lot of times, not that they're ignorant, but I was ignorant prior to coming here, prior to working in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I think that just bleeds over, like, what you know, and you make decisions based on that. But I know the people I work for, as I said, like, part of the reason they wanted me to do this job was for that very reason. They're very cognizant of it, and we just have to do a better job.
Thank you. Based on what you've heard from the federal government and provincial health officers, is the promise to vaccinate all Canadians by September, or even in some cases, early summer, realistic?
That is a very loaded question. I wish I had the answer to. We've spent a long time of the past month. It feels like I sleep, I breathe, I eat vaccines all the time. We've talked about it a ton on the show. I think there's two ways to look at it. So the first of the past 6 weeks, what we've really focused on is the supply, right? The promise has come from the federal government. Anyone who wants a vaccine by the end of September should be able to access one. There will be enough vaccines in Canada. I'm sure you guys are all familiar that the supply of vaccines over the first month and a half of the year was severely constrained. It was not as advertised. It slowed down, but the promise was maintained that the end of the quarter, so the end of March, would see the deliveries that the companies had contractually obligated themselves to. And it looks like that's going to happen. And then there's another deadline for Q2 and another for Q3. So if I were to wager a guess right now, it does look like the supply will be there, though I hedge the guess. As I mentioned, I'm always wrong in making predictions, but I also hedge it because we have seen, because we're dependent on those vaccines coming from elsewhere. And so there's a whole host of things that could impede it, everything from what happened in Europe around export controls to something maybe for the better happening in the United States, and that maybe they get enough vaccines out that all of a sudden they're okay to send us a few. But we're just sort of, I don't know if there are any necessarily guarantees, like there are contractual obligations, but we've seen the evidence so far that things can kind of go awry. But if things do go as planned, the supply will be there. The second half of the equation has to very much do with the subject of my speech, and it shifts from the federal government to the provinces, right? And now the focus is, or as the supply ramps up, 1 million this week, 1 million next week, how fast are provinces able to administer those vaccines? And are their systems where they should be to be able to fully take advantage of the supply? The complicating factor is last week's announcement that most provinces are now going to delay the second dose by 4 months. So then does it become, do we assess based on a first dose level of immunity? Oh, everybody has a vaccine by the summer, well, they have 1 dose. Or do we continue basing it on a second dose? I think those are all questions to look at. But right now, it seems like the provinces are under a lot of pressure to administer that supply. BC, you'll see yesterday, had their phone lines crash as they opened them up. Ontario isn't even opening their online portal for a while. Alberta had big issues in those first few days. So the jury remains out, I think, on the province's ability to administer all the supply that comes in. And the jury also remains out on whether or not we can guarantee that supply will come in. Overall, September is still a long way away. I'm a naturally optimistic person, which makes me probably unfit for the media, but so I'm hopeful. I mean, who wouldn't hope that that ends up being the case? We'll just have to see.
I think we all appreciate the hopeful outlook right now. So thanks for giving
You
us
have
that.
to be hopeful.
Vassy, last night someone mentioned that your interview skills are similar, akin to a good cross-examination in court, and we actually have a question here about your interview skills. One student asked, I'm curious how you approach interviewing politicians on an issue you know will result in reluctance to give direct answers to your questions. What goes through your mind when you're approaching this situation, and how do you gauge your strategy? What factors are you considering?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I think disappointingly, that's the majority of interviews that I do conduct with politicians. I'm always kind of approaching it from the perspective that I probably won't get a direct answer to my question. I think very long and hard about the way I'm going to approach an interview. I purposely take a specific tone in all accountability interviews. I'm not interested in a 30-second clip that's going to go viral. I'm not interested in making myself the center of the interview. I think, from my perspective, I've really, over the last 3 years, acquired, I think, a lot more skills in the way I conduct interviews, and it's important to me to be respectful. That's just, a lot of people want me to, based on the emails I get, yell or scream or, just be more, overtly aggressive, and it's just not me. It's not my style. And so at the end of the day, I always go in thinking, okay, well, what do people want to know about this interview? The interview you're referencing is from Minister Sajjan I think it was last week or the week before, on everything that was going on with the military. And by that, I mean all the allegations of sexual misconduct against the former CDS and the sort of somewhat former CDS, both of them. And I went in thinking, okay, what I really want to know, and what I think Canadians want to know, is, did the minister have knowledge of any of this? Like, is there the chance that, as the opposition will contend, that the government was aware of some of this and let it go on, or knew there were doubts about the ability of 1 or 2 of these men to hold this position and brushed it aside? And so I sort of went in with that perspective and just tried to get an answer. And it's always a balancing act, because when you don't get any answer, you'll ask again, and then you'll point it out. But it's always a gut feeling I have to go with, like, how long do you go before you move on to the next question? I've gotten a lot more used to it now, so I think it's more instinctual than it ever was. But a lot of people say, like, how come you're not more frustrated? And again, it's like, you train yourself to show restraint, right? Like you have no other option, as I'm sure all of you know much better than me. And so that's how I always go in thinking, like, what do people really want to know? At the same time, there's only so much you can do in advance. So you think of those questions, or think of the approach you want to take. You think of the questions, you think at the end of the day of the audience first and foremost. But most of the time, I never end up using really what I've prepared. I use the background information that the producer has helped me so much with, and that I've kind of committed to memory, and I use those facts to challenge them. But most of the time you can't really anticipate exactly how they're going to answer something, or if they'll be evasive, and if they are, to what degree. And so much like I'm sure in a courtroom, you have to pivot when necessary, which is kind of all of the time. So I say that I have all these grandiose visions going into an interview, but most of the time, even in that instance, the minister wouldn't answer to me whether he had known about allegations prior to, I think the question was about, did you know about the allegations prior to appointing the latest CDS? And it took like 6 questions of round and round because of the word choice. Like it just wasn't, the answer wasn't what I expected. It wasn't even a blanket no comment. It sort of had some caveats in there. So I ended up going on that tangent because I sort of had to. So even my best laid plans often get thrown to the side.
The next question will probably tie into what you were actually just talking about. But what advice would you give to a young lawyer who is interested in getting into journalism?
Oh, wow. I thought it was going to be the other way around. I was telling everybody last night that that I'm a perpetual disappointment to my dad, who's a lawyer, because I never became a lawyer, though my sister has become a wonderful lawyer. So thank goodness, took a lot of the heat off me. I think I'm a big proponent of people coming from other walks of life into journalism. I wish there were more of that. I actually didn't even study it in my degrees. I ended up taking like a brief course for how to be on TV. I mean, the study of journalism is great, but I love the idea of someone with a very specific expertise coming into the field. As far as advice, I'm not the most qualified person to give it. I think I think there's a few things you have to know about the field. It is, you will always be told it's dying, and you will always be told there's no jobs. And I'm, again, the optimist in me will tell you that's since the day I started in 2008, I've been told that. And I've been lucky enough to be employed ever since and to enjoy every second of it. And I think it can be a frustrating industry to work in. It can be really hard, I would say, especially over the past few years, because there's a lot of vitriol towards what we do. And some of it, some of the anger, some of the frustration, very much deserved. We're not immune from critique by any stretch of the imagination, but it's become like you have to have a really thick skin, something I don't come by naturally. So be prepared for that. And don't think you're going to make a lot of money. You won't come close to what you'll make as a lawyer. Sounds vain, but keep that in mind, I think, when you go into it. And otherwise, it's the same. I mean, it's the same things I see. I'm lucky enough to have an example in my dad and my mom who also worked in the law firm, of the same sort of things that end up serving you well in this career. And mostly that's a work ethic and the ability to want to work your way up and not feel entitled and just work a lot. And I don't know any law school student or lawyer who isn't a really, really hard worker. So employ those skills in journalism as well. Otherwise, I feel so unqualified to give advice about getting into this industry. Just do it because you want to, and don't think you're going to get rich.
We appreciate the advice, Vassy. Thank you. I think since Sunday, especially, the British Crown has been a bit of a hot button topic. And we have a question here that says, recent polling suggests that the British Crown and the institution of the Governor General are historically unpopular in Canada at the moment. Do you think this will become a political and national unity issue in the near future?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure if I thought about it from that vantage point. It's interesting you bring that up right now. Right before I went into this, I was watching the Prime Minister take questions, and he actually got a number of questions about that and sort of linking what happened over the weekend and some of the allegations that came forth to what that does to the relevancy of the monarchy in Canada. And we had already been having that discussion, albeit in a different context when it comes to the Governor General, which my colleague Ashley Burke has done some really heavy hitting work on, especially around that environment that was taking place that is in existence at Rideau Hall. I don't pretend to know the mood of Canada when it comes to the monarchy. It's definitely not something I have studied at length or have immersed myself in at length. I think there isn't a huge appetite for a lot of what Ashley described in her reporting. I think some of the expenditures they're allowed to access, for example, once they leave the post, I understand why that rubs people the wrong way. I feel like there's a pretty big divide when it comes to the monarchy, not nearly perhaps as divisive as in the UK right now. I don't know if it becomes, I mean, I don't think if there's an election in the spring or the fall, I still think the pandemic is like overwhelming everything else when it comes to election issues. I don't know if it, I like the opposition is, some opposition parties are willing to come out and say this shouldn't be, this, you know, the monarchy should no longer be, et cetera, et cetera. It requires so much to change. You got to get the consent of the provinces. I just think it requires a level of political will and logistics that in normal times would be a challenge, in pandemic times would be, I'd wager, almost impossible. So I'm not sure it ends up being a huge political issue given the current context and other issues right now. But that's not to say that could never be the case.
Thank you. How do you manage the dangers of perception and the actual conflicts of interest as a political reporter?
So I'm not sure about perception of, sorry, the perception of what?
It didn't specify, but I'm assuming like perception of information, making sure it's
like if
not
you're biased. Well, I'm pretty much accused of, I mean, political journalists are accused of, I mean, I think Twitter exists just to accuse some bias of one sort or the other. Again, something that definitely got more to me when I started in this job, and now I just have all the filters applied and I ignore it. I think you have to be, I mean, it should consume you as a political reporter. It should be informing every single decision that you make. And I'll give you an example. So in our morning meeting, we determine what our best case scenario is for a lineup. And I have 3 hours of programming every night. So I'm always thinking, okay, if I interview the government here, where will the opposition reaction be? If the government says no to appearing, is there a clip that we can put somewhere in the show? If the opposition isn't free or we don't have the time, let's make sure we get a clip of them on the issue in China or of genocide, which we have today. If the government says no, let's make sure we say that. Like, I probably think about it 70% of my day, to be completely frank. I am consumed with our show and making sure we are free of that perception. We are not, though. There is a constant perception from, I mean, look at the environment in the States, the environment here. People look at things the way they look at them. All I can do is I have to be able to sleep at night. That's how I kind of measure it. I have to go by my gut. I have to be able to sleep at night, and I have to do my best every single day, not only within the show, so the lineup of the show, but my own interviews, and try and be as fair as possible. And by fair, I mean equally hard on everyone who comes on the program, regardless of political stripe. But if I'm going hard on 5 liberals in a 2-hour span, I have to be cognizant of that too, right? Then that looks a certain way, that seems like I'm only choosing one side to go hard on. So then I need to make sure that there's opposition in there too. And you know, those are constant things that I'm thinking about. As far as conflict of interest goes, this network is fantastic when it comes to that. From my perception, when I started here, I had to declare, you know, is there anything anything in your history that we need to know? Is there, you know, and you basically remove yourself from those situations if like I wouldn't interview somebody, let's say, who's my cousin if he were in politics, things along those lines. We also, for example, can't take any money for events. We can't have our travel expenses paid for. Everything has to be signed off on from the head of kind of the head person who governs ethics in the network. So there's a lot of people looking to double check that we are free of conflict of interest. Again, it's something that should and does consume me. I think especially as I mean, all journalists, but especially as political journalists, we're being scrutinized for that. I have no problem with that scrutiny. And if I don't have a gut feeling about that stuff by this point in my career, I'm in big trouble. So I think about bias all the time. I think about the way I approach interviews, the way the show approaches who we have on, and certainly if I were ever in a conflict of interest, it would be, I never have had to remove myself because there's nothing that I've had immediately before me, but I wouldn't have a second of doubt.
So we have a few questions here, people kind of wanting to ask about the aftermath of COVID here. And specifically, I'll ask this question. When we come out of the COVID tunnel, do you think people's preconceived vision of political leaders in parts of Canada will change, or will people be more jaded about the federal and provincial leadership? And how many years will it take to heal?
Oh, that's such a good question. I've actually been kind of thinking about that lately because we've been talking on our show a lot about the relationship between the feds and the provinces, and in particular, like how the public has viewed each of their performances. There was this, almost in the way I described in my speech, this 6-month period, right? Which was like, oh, the government, like, people really had positive feelings towards the government because there was a distinct role for government in our lives, right? Whether it came to lockdown conditions or supports or stimulus of whatever degree, or health, like that stuff was very important to all of us. And so you saw this almost like honeymoon period for governments. And then you saw provinces almost, not in a cynical way, but take advantage of it, maybe in a cynical way, insofar as there were elections in various provinces. And even though there was outcry at the beginning, oh, how could you do this? It's a pandemic. At the end of the day, the incumbents were voted back in. But I think the question hits at something, a level of nuance that is really important. And that is, things have changed over the last few months. And I tried to get at that in my speech. Publicly facing, privately, like the love-in is no longer. And I think you've seen, to various degrees at the federal level and at the provincial level, a growing cynicism among people towards those politicians. And it all has to do, and it's different in every province. Maybe it feels like the premier's gone too far or not far enough, or the response has been laggard. I think it's difficult at this juncture to predetermine whether that stays, whether it gets worse or it gets better. And I also think it's going to be really regional. It's not going to be easy to say straight across the country. But I also wonder, I just wonder, once we're out of the pandemic fog and people sit back and they're asked to assess their government, whether it be the federal or the provincial one, whether they're going to feel like, okay, these guys have done a pretty good job getting us through this, or we don't know what awaits us on the other side, right? Like, how bad will the economy be? Will they lay fault for that at a politician's feet? Like, I don't know. I think there are a lot of factors that we can't yet determine. But I think the question is one, because I do sense this sort of, frustration, and it's not, sometimes it's like people coming up to me and saying, or virtually saying, I'm just so, oh, why didn't the government get this right on vaccines? And they're just speaking of the government. Like, there's no specific politician they have in mind. So, like, is there going to be an increase in cynicism, and will that have an impact on the electoral future of any of these politicians? I think it's a good question to ask. I just can't answer it yet.
Do you see it as a problem that we have people without legal training communicating legal concepts to the general public?
So is it a problem that journalists are covering legal decisions? I think I sort of, like, that probably be one way to approach it. I mean, I'm sure people who are experts in climate policy don't love that I'm the one communicating a lot of these decisions or various policies to the government either. I think this is sort of in the same vein as one of the earlier questions. Look, we are a show that constantly has experts on as well to help substitute where my knowledge lacks. And certainly all journalists, I think, should and do to a certain degree strive to do that. The more experts we can have distilling stuff for the public, the better. The one thing I will say is, again, when I'm approaching stuff that is complicated, I want to make it as simple and digestible for people who are not immersed in it as possible. And sometimes the challenge with people who are subject matter experts is, and this is just because they are so smart, is that they don't communicate in a way that distills things for a wider audience. And so, like, when we find experts who can, then we just gravitate to them like crazy. maybe it's more incumbent on journalists to draw on that expertise to inform themselves as much as possible. It helps when those experts are also good communicators. I would add that.
So Vassy, I know you're the one that's used to typically putting people on the hot seat and interviewing people, but we've got lots of questions here that are enjoying the chance to have you here on the hot seat. And so I'll ask you one of these questions. And somebody asks, why are premiers not challenged on their disregard for context? Keystone, for example, was not challenged on the fact that Biden had been in presidency for mere hours as Kenney was asking for a major fight. And then also mentioned the vaccine supply was also a supply chain issue, but again, Kenney placed it on the personal purview of Trudeau himself. So just asking about, why are these premiers not being pressed on these harder?
So again, I can only speak for myself, and I'll have to disagree factually with the assertions made in that statement. The interview that I very poorly did not show the visuals for was with Premier Kenney. In fact, I think I spent 3 questions on challenging him around the investment that he made while knowing that President Biden held the view that he did, that he was standing next to Obama when he killed the bill that would have seen the pipeline go ahead. And I think I've had Scott Moe on, the Premier of Saskatchewan, and at length challenged him over the supply issues, the context around the supply issues. So I'd have to ask you to watch those interviews in full before you jump to the conclusion that they're not challenged. My guess is you're referencing some of the press conferences that take place every day in which journalists are allowed 1 question and 1 follow-up. It also happens at the federal level. I'm a huge, I don't love those press conferences. I think there's no accountability when you can only have 1 question and 1 follow-up. And it allows politicians to avoid more follow-ups, which are needed for true accountability. So I get that frustration, but I have to say, on both those points, if you were to watch my last 2 interviews with each of those premiers, they were challenged at length.
So some of your colleagues have been outspoken about the gendered obstacles faced by women in the media, including serious online harassment. So this individual was asking, since you clearly have such an outstanding career despite this, do you have any tips or advice to students entering the field of law who might suffer from the same type of gendered obstacles?
Oh, that's a very good question and a tough one. I mean, I think, it depends on a lot. It's not just gender, it's race, which we've clearly all had our eyes opened up to. I come from a pretty privileged position. So if I'm being completely honest, I haven't faced a huge amount of obstacles. I think the hardest part, and it certainly hasn't come from within any of the organizations I've worked in, but has mostly come from the public. Like I was saying, I didn't really start with a thick skin. And I mean, look, there's people who go through way worse and it can be way harder, but I have experienced some pretty harsh things. I'm pregnant right now, and I can tell you the last 7 months have been, it's just crazy to like go into an interview and be concentrating so hard and then someone be sending you a note about how fat you're getting. Like, I don't know if I think that's somewhat gendered. I don't know for sure, but my instinct tells me that it is. So as far as, I don't know if I'm qualified to give advice to people in the legal field. I know it's a bit different. I don't know if it's exactly the same or if the hurdles are necessarily completely aligned. Yeah, I don't know if I'm not an expert. All I know is that I was afforded a lot of opportunities, and I've been very lucky in my career trajectory so far, and I've had very supportive bosses along the way. I've had incidents like everybody else, I think, but I draw my inspiration from I'm very lucky in that I had so many people before me who carved out paths at this network and in Canada, and I sort of just am lucky to follow in their footsteps. They did a lot of the hard work. I don't think I really did. Sorry, it's not a great answer. Not great advice.
Vassy, I think we would kindly or respectfully disagree with that statement that you're not good advice, because we've really appreciated having you here so far. And there are still a ton of questions coming through, which we appreciate, but I'm mindful of the fact that we've almost run out of time. So maybe I'll wrap it up here with one more question that ties back to a bit of the unity theme of your lecture. And so someone asks, what are the strengths each of the regions of Canada brings to the Federation, and what challenges do you see each region causing to the health and future of the Federation?
What challenges? I mean, the biggest challenge that I see is the sentiment, the sentiment that the Federation isn't working. And I don't know if that's unique to any one region. I think it's more predominant at certain times in certain regions. And as someone who, as I started off my speech, has lived all over this country, I'm so in love with this country, and it's kind of hard to see. It's sad, and it's I'm sure most of us on this call, you know, like I'm not unsympathetic to the reasons behind it. I'm not unempathetic to them, but it poses a big challenge, I think, going forward. And as someone alluded to in the question, the electoral system might have something to do with that as well. So I think that's a big thing. But I think the pandemic has also showed, like, how would we have done this as separate parts, right? How would it have worked if all of those, all of that sentiment actually manifested, actually came to fruition? I don't know if the country would have made it, although there's been so many challenges and disappointments and things. I'm not trying to say it was perfect, but I don't know if the response could be what it was without some level of cooperation. And so I think regions brought a lot to the table in that regard. As far as what they specifically do, I mean, I don't know. I think there's a lot to piece together in that one. How long do we have? I just, you know, it's going to be interesting to see. I can't predict necessarily whether they bring those things to the table, whether it continues, you know, they bring the opposite and then it continues to challenge the Federation. I think what I'm watching and what I have been watching is that it's all very political, right? Like I said, during elections and in future elections, it's easy stuff to grab onto, and it becomes very much a part of the political rhetoric during those elections and thereafter. And so to me, the big question then becomes, does that rhetoric become more permanently damaging? And I'm not talking that it's coming in one direction, it's coming in multiple directions, but does it become more damaging? Does it become more the norm? Does it become a part of everyone's regular rhetoric? And then what happens after that? I don't know. Again, I can't pretend to predict what will end up happening, or who is going to be be the prime minister and what voice they'll lend to all of that. But I understand the concerns around it, and I certainly noticed the heightened political rhetoric pre-pandemic and now kind of towards hopefully the end of this pandemic.
Thank you so much for your time and all your thoughtful answers. I know there's a lot more questions in the chat, but for the sake of time, I'm actually going to conclude the question and answer period here and pass the mic over to Dean Holloway.
Thank you very much. Nahani and Jared, you guys were great. That was wonderful. Vassy, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for a really extraordinary talk today. This was the first time that we've ever done the Leitch lecture this way, but after listening to you, I'm not sure it's going to be the last. You really, really brought this to life, incorporating video into it, making it real, making it part of our lived experience is something very, very special. So thank you very much. And on behalf of both law schools, I'm going to, in a 21st century COVID way, present you with an award on behalf of both law schools. We'll mail it to you, and then you can make all of your colleagues at the CBC and jealousy that they don't have one of these as well. So Vassy, on behalf of all of us, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for a really extraordinary 2021 Leitch lecture.
Thank you so much. It's truly an honor. I appreciate it.
Now, Barb.
Thanks. So I want to echo, of course, Dean Holloway's gratitude to Vassy and everybody involved in today's event. I think everyone would agree that it's been one of the most successful lectures we've had, and it was very entertaining, Vassy, to see all of the videos that you were able to provide in this format. I'd like to invite everyone, an early invitation for next year's Leitch lecture, time and date to be determined. Hopefully, fingers crossed, by that time we'll be able to answer many of the questions posed to Vassy today about what happens after the pandemic. Hopefully we'll have all those answers. So 1 year from today, much earlier than 1 year from today, all things going well. So thank you, everybody, and thanks for attending. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vassy.
Have a good show today, Vassy. We're all good.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.